Hey everyone, this is Jamie Russo. I am the CEO of Everything Coworking and the host of the Everything Coworking podcast. If you're not a listener, we have a new episode that comes out every single Wednesday. This week, it's today Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. Jonathan O'Byrne is my guest today. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So my mission is to help operators and community managers attract and retain their best members. And I do that through my co-working startup school and my community manager university and co-working Q&As just like this. So I have some great questions to run through today. If you're watching and you want to add some questions, if you're watching live, I should say, and you want to add questions, just add a comment and I'll be able to see the questions and answer them. And if you're not watching live, but you want to ask a question for next week, you can put your question on the post that advertises the weekly Q&A in our Facebook group, which is at everythingcoworking.com. Let's see. Search for it on Facebook since that's where you are. Just search for the Everything Coworking Facebook group and you'll find it there. So I'm going to dive into our questions for today. The first one is from Aman, and Aman asked about subleasing clauses in a lease, in a commercial lease. And this is a super important question. I cover this with my co-working startup school students. The co-working lease, your commercial lease, when you sign a lease for a space, and if you already have a space, hopefully this is in your clause. But if it's not, certainly the next time you sign a lease, you want one in there. And if you are searching for a space or about to embark on that journey, this is super important. Many clauses in the US, at least, I can't speak for what the sublease clause looks like outside of the US, will specify whether or not the space can be subleased. Some states require essentially that the landlord allow a subleasing arrangement, but they can approve the new party who's going to sublease. So essentially, it can't be prevented within, good reason. But you want to be really careful that your lease is not construed as your entire business being in the business of subleasing. So we don't sublease space, right? Subleasing is when a lot of what's happening, unfortunately, in our current environment where a business no longer wants, needs, or can afford to pay for their space, they will not break their lease. They won't just abandon the space, but they'll try to find another party to take over that space and essentially sign the lease and take on the liability of that lease for the rest of its term. So they're not signing a brand new lease. They're taking all of what's written in your lease and they're adopting that versus starting the process from scratch as a new tenant. So landlords don't necessarily love that process because it doesn't allow them to change any of the terms. It doesn't allow them to change the rent rate, etc. So they don't want you to necessarily be able to do that. And you don't want to be perceived as doing that. You don't want to give your landlord a reason to use that if you're having some discussions or negotiations about some other aspect of your relationship as a tenant. So the sublease clause is not something that you would necessarily change, but what you want to do is have an addendum in your lease that describes your business and what you do and has the landlord sign off and say, I understand that and it's allowed under the terms of this lease. And then when you write your agreements with your members, you want that to be a licensing agreement. So you are the licensor of the space and they are the licensee. In your commercial lease, you are the lessee and the landlord is the lessor. So that's the relationship. You want to make sure you use a license agreement, which, could be similar to what you're doing with a gym membership, right? Like the gym membership is not assigning space to you. They're letting you come in and work out and use the space, or a hotel arrangement or that kind of thing. But generally, if you use the licensing language in your membership agreements, so when you have a membership agreement, it's not a lease, and it's a licensing agreement for the office or for the hot desk or for the dedicated desk. And that should do it. But in your lease, you do want a section that says this is the business I'm in. I license space to other businesses that will be coming in and using the space. And the landlord signs off and says, yes, I get it, that's what this person does. I'm good with it. We're good to go. The next question I have is from Fernanda, and she has posted in the Facebook group that she is super, super frustrated with members not following housekeeping rules. And raise your hand if you're an operator and you totally get that. This is a challenge. I think spaces can struggle with this, or sometimes not. There were some responses to the post saying, oh, our members are super respectful. They perceive the space as being their own. They take really good care of it. I think this is really important. And another thing I coach my co-working startup school students on is that from the day you open and start accepting members, you have to really, really carefully set the tone of your culture. So you as the owner, you as the community manager, anybody who's on the team, you have to be intentional and thoughtful about how you want the space to run and work and how you want members to act and what the norms are in the space before you even open your doors, so that you're prepared for this. It can be a little bit challenging to manage this or to correct this on the fly. But certainly once you open, if there are things you didn't think about ahead of time that members are doing, you want to address that immediately and put systems or processes in place so that you can manage that with ongoing members. So one easy example is dishes in the sink, right? So I'll back up a little bit more broadly on that topic and say, you decide as a space where you sit on the hospitality spectrum. So are you a we do it for you sort of space, or are you members kind of own the space and they do their own thing and they're really kind of self-sufficient? So some examples of that would be, does the community manager make the coffee and refill the air pot, every couple of hours? Or do you train new members to make their own coffee? And if the coffee needs to be made, whatever member sort of encounters that empty air pot makes the next batch. Dishes. Do members leave coffee mugs around the space and you collect them and put them in the dishwasher? Or are there, clear expectations that members walk their mugs and put them in the dishwasher? Refrigerator. Is the expectation that the members manage the refrigerator, take everything out on Friday, or are you cleaning out the refrigerator and dealing with messes, etc.? Conference rooms. Do you have lots of signs posted in the conference rooms about expectations on behavior, how to clean up, how the conference room should look when someone leaves the room? Or does your team go in and make everything, kind of super sparkly and clean after a member has been in that meeting room? So it's really thinking about how much responsibility around sort of housekeeping are you going to put on the member versus will your staff do? And, that probably applies across the board to some of the examples I just mentioned. And then you really set that tone and set that expectation as you onboard members. So be really explicit with members. We used to do this, and somebody mentioned this in the comment to the post, is we had a member norms page that we would have our members read, and they had to initial it. This was not something they could just, hit I agree, continue to. They had to initial several of the lines on that agreement, and we would go through that in person with them. Getting members to onboard in person can be challenging, but if you can get them to do that, to make that investment, it's really where you can set the tone around, how things work. And this is really important. Make sure your team is aligned on this, because you want, if you're a community manager, you need to be clear what the expectation is so that you can manage that with members. You have to be comfortable with new members. If your deal is member puts coffee mug in the dishwasher and you walk into the kitchen and member drops coffee mug, this is my favorite, with the tea bag still in it, in the sink, then community manager needs to be comfortable saying, hey, Dave, in our co-working space, we put our mugs in the dishwasher. The team simply can't keep up with the volume during the day. So we ask that you take care of it. Your tea bag can go straight into the compost bin. That's probably just a California thing. Annabelle, thank you for the question. I will get to your question in a minute. So you have to be really intentional and consistent about it. And as a community manager or an owner that's active in the space, you want to make sure you're constantly kind of navigating and pointing people towards the norms. You can do that with signage. The challenge with signage is at some point people gloss over it, right? So you can change it up every once in a while to keep it fresh. But really, it's going to be those cues that come from you and other members as to how things are done in this space. And I think if you let it go for too long, which may be Fernanda's situation, is not giving those cues, not being direct enough with members, then things start to fall apart and people sort of misbehave. And I'm super into being direct because I think people need really clear expectations set, and they need constant reminders. Is if you come in the morning and the dishwasher, the sink is full of dishes that people didn't put in the dishwasher, and that's the expectation in your space, take a look at the video camera, see who did it, and send them an email and let them know, hey, I noticed that your mug with the tea bag went in the sink last night. We really need everyone to do their share to take care of the space. We do X to take care of the space, and we leave the rest to you. And then Annabelle, I'm going to go through one more question that we had submitted ahead of time before I get to yours. Katie asked about emailing post-tour. And I teach a sales sequence to my community manager group. We just went through that training a couple of months ago. So what's really critical that I wanted to note, because Katie said, how do you get their emails? And somebody else said, well, because of COVID, we're required to capture an email address from everyone that comes into the space. And Katie said, oh, that's not the case where I am. And I don't get everybody's email. So even if you aren't capturing emails for COVID, you are absolutely within your right to say, for security reasons, we need to have everyone sign in when they come in the door, if they're in the space for a tour, if they're a guest, not if they're a member, and they're probably tracked through the door access system or the Wi-Fi. But anybody who's not a member should be signing in at your front desk. So I suggest you do this with a tablet. It doesn't have to be an iPad. It can be, something that's refurbished. Have a simple Google form. There are apps you can use. So Greetly has one. Envoy has one. There are apps that you can use to get folks to sign in. If you have a large space, those apps can notify their guests as well, which is great. If you simply need a sign-in form, you can have a tablet with a Google form. I recommend this over a manual sign-in sheet because I can't tell you, we used to do manual sign-in sheet. I can't tell you the number of times. Well, we fixed this pretty quickly, but we would consistently get people who had terrible handwriting and we couldn't read their email address or their name. And you don't want that, right? And this is really for people who are walk-in tours. Try to get folks to schedule through your website, right? Have Calendly or Acuity, something on your website so they can book directly. And then you're capturing all that information. Certainly make sure you're capturing email, name, and phone number if you can. But if they walk in or they're a guest or even there for an event, capture their information. Now, I will say, here's a quick caveat, is that particularly outside of the US, you are supposed to ask for permission to email them for matters that aren't directly related to whatever it is that they signed in for. So if you want to put them on your nurture newsletter, your marketing newsletter, for example, you're supposed to ask them for permission. That is particularly the case where GDPR is in effect, which is outside of the US in general. So be careful about that, but do capture their email address so that you can do your email follow-up series, and do not hesitate to tell them it's required for security. I've never seen anybody say they wouldn't hand over their email address unless, there was something shady going on. Annabelle, any ideas on structuring base rent plus turnover percentage agreements with landlords? Annabelle, I don't know what turnover percentage means. If you're still there, tell me what that means. I did a Q&A with Mike Abrams a couple of weeks ago. If you scroll down in the feed on the page, that should come up, and he answered a bunch of questions about structuring management agreement. He was on a podcast I did recently also. If you're a podcast listener, it was only a few episodes ago. It's the Everything Coworking podcast, but I don't know what turnover percentage agreement means, if that's a retail term. So you have to give me some more detail on that. Anybody else have any questions that I can address while we're here live? Annabelle, feel free to drop that into the Facebook group if you've disappeared and we can't answer that for you today. I hate for people to leave without getting their questions answered. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for joining me today. If you have questions you want me to answer in the future, put them in the Facebook group. We have a promo image for the weekly co-working Q&A. You can drop it underneath that image, and we'll see you in the Facebook group and see you. Oh, Annabelle coming back. Okay, they want a report of occupancy and to get a percentage of your membership fees. Oh, they want, okay, so they want base rent plus some percentage of your revenue. Got it. So, I mean, that really, really depends. Mike might kill me for this. You might ask Mike about structuring his, you can find him on LinkedIn. Okay, great. Yeah, you found the podcast episode. You can ping him on LinkedIn and ask him. The trick is it really depends. So how much is base rent? How much less is base rent than market rent, for example, right? So if it's close to market rent, then you're going to give them less of a percentage of your monthly revenue. If you're paying a really low base rent, like just enough to make it qualify for a lease, and it's a super great deal for you, you're going to pay more of your monthly revenue. How much of the build out did they pay for? If they pay for the build out, you're going to give them, maybe a lower base rent plus a bigger percentage of your monthly membership fees. But also you want to think about managing expenses. I would maybe not think about sharing revenue, but sharing profit. So they may need reporting around, your expenses, so this is one of the sort of trade-offs of management agreements is the reporting that goes, you got to be really tight on your books. You have a new constituent you're providing reports to about your business, but I would do profit, not on revenue, because what if you're not making a profit, but your revenue looks high to them and you're taking giving them a percentage of your revenue, but you're not actually profitable. I would also make sure that if you're doing a management agreement, that your management fee is an operating expense. It doesn't, sort of come out after that. So any profit share you do with a landlord should be after you get paid for managing the space, marketing the space. And when I say managing the space, I mean you're managing the team. You personally may not be running the space, but you're managing the team that's running the space. You're managing, communicating maintenance issues, and maybe the landlord's fixing those. You're getting the carpets clean. You're doing all the things plus marketing, plus community building. You're doing the heavy lift on attracting and retaining those members. And that's a big deal, because if the landlord has a traditional tenant, that tenant is paying market rent and they're not paying twice as much. The multiple on market rent has somewhat to do with flexibility in the terms, but it has a lot to do with the service that you're offering, and you are providing that service or someone that you are paying. So the community manager salary is an expense that comes out before that profit share with the landlord, as is your management fee. So it just really depends a lot on what the factors are. Build out, who's paying for that, FF&E, who's paying for that, how much base rent are you paying, and then what profit share makes sense. And I think the best way to think about it is the deal needs to look good to you and to the landlord, right? You need to look at the deal and say, that's worth my time. This is a way I want to grow my brand, and that's a good ROI of my time. And the landlord needs to look at the result that he would get monthly and say, that's more than I could get with a traditional tenant. That's the best use of my building. I like this deal. So it's like you're kind of tweaking the different components of that agreement until you get to that point. Cool. Yeah. And Annabelle, if you get into it and you have more specific questions, drop them in the group. And Mike has been super helpful with follow-up questions as well. All right. I'm going to let you guys go. We've been here for 20 minutes. Time to go back to work. I will see you next week.